I froze, clutching the waistband of my jeans as the door swung open. Ethan stood there, his eyes widening as they met mine. My heart raced. He wasn't supposed to see me like this. His gaze lingered, warm and unreadable, and for the first time I felt something I shouldn't. My late husband's son. And now, the one person I couldn't stop thinking about. Diana lived a life that most would call serene, though it often felt hollow since her husband, Bill, passed away. Her days were filled with quiet routines. Early mornings sipping coffee by the window, afternoons spent tending to a garden that seemed as neglected as her emotions, and nights lying awake in a bed too big for one person. She was a woman accustomed to solitude, yet the emptiness never felt any lighter. Ethan, Bill's son from his first marriage, had become an unexpected presence in her life. After Bill's passing, Ethan took it upon himself to look after Diana, fixing leaky faucets, bringing over groceries, and occasionally staying long enough to fill the void left in the house. Ethan was everything Bill had been, kind, attentive, and unerringly reliable. Yet, there was something else, a spark in his gaze when their eyes met, a warmth in his touch that lingered a moment too long. Diana tried to ignore it. She convinced herself it was nothing more than misplaced gratitude, a desperate attempt to feel connected to the man she lost. Yet Ethan's presence felt different, unsettling in ways she couldn't explain. He wasn't just there to help, he was there for her. The way he spoke her name, softer than a whisper, or the way his hand brushed hers when passing a cup of coffee. These moments stayed with her long after he left. Their relationship was simple on the surface, defined by household repairs and polite conversation. But beneath the simplicity lay an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken truth that neither dared to acknowledge. Diana felt safe when Ethan was around, but that safety carried a dangerous edge. It wasn't just that he reminded her of Bill. It was that Ethan was his own person, strong, steady, and undeniably magnetic. As Diana sat on her porch one evening, staring at the sun dipping below the horizon, she wondered when her loneliness had transformed into something far more dangerous. Ethan had become more than just a reminder of Bill. He had become a lifeline to a part of her she thought was long buried. But was it comfort she sought, or something much more forbidden? The shift between Diana and Ethan was subtle at first, like the faint crack of ice before it splinters. It began with stolen glances, accidental touches, and conversations that lingered a beat too long. Diana told herself she was imagining things, that her loneliness was warping her perception. But every time Ethan stepped into her home, the air seemed to thicken, making it impossible to breathe easily. Ethan's visits became more frequent. He always arrived with a reason, a broken gutter, groceries he insisted she needed, or a task that, in truth, she could have easily handled herself. Yet she never refused him. Diana felt torn between the comfort his presence brought and the unease that followed after he left. She tried to keep a safe distance, yet her resolve wavered each time he smiled at her with that quiet, steady charm. It wasn't just his actions that raised her suspicions, it was how they made her feel. The simple gesture of him handing her a cup of coffee felt weighted, his fingers brushing hers lingering like a question unasked. When he laughed, the sound filled the room in a way her silence never could. One afternoon, while Ethan worked on repairing a loose hinge on the back door, Diana caught herself watching him longer than she should have. His shirt clung to his back, damp from the afternoon sun, and her heart betrayed her, skipping a beat as he glanced over his shoulder and caught her staring. "You okay?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze steady. "Fine," she replied quickly, averting her eyes and retreating into the kitchen. But she wasn't fine. Every moment they spent together seemed to tighten a knot in her chest, one that she wasn't sure she wanted to untangle. She began to notice the way he lingered, how his eyes stayed on her a fraction longer than necessary, and the subtle tension that crackled between them in the quiet moments. One evening, as Diana sat on the couch, lost in thought, Ethan returned with takeout from her favorite Italian restaurant. "Figured you might not feel like cooking," he said, setting the bag on the counter. She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped when she saw the softness in his eyes. The warmth of the gesture spread through her like sunlight breaking through clouds, even as she told herself she shouldn't feel this way. They sat at the dining table, the soft glow of the chandelier illuminating the space between them. The conversation started light, but gradually grew more personal. Ethan spoke about his father, his voice tinged with regret as he admitted, "I always thought I'd have more time to prove myself to him." Diana felt her chest tighten at the vulnerability in his tone. She reached across the table, her hand covering his without thinking. He was proud of you, she said softly. I'm proud of you. Her words hung in the air, and when she pulled her hand back, she realized too late that she'd crossed a line. Ethan's gaze held hers, steady and unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. The following days only deepened the tension. Diana found herself replaying their conversations, dissecting every look, every touch, every word. She couldn't tell if she was imagining the way he seemed to inch closer to her, the way his voice softened when he said her name, or if something had truly shifted between them. But one thing was certain. The boundary they had both carefully upheld was beginning to blur, and Diana wasn't sure if she wanted to stop it, or if she even could. The boundary between Diana and Ethan, once clear and firm, was now a shadowy line they danced around, neither daring to address it outright. But as the days turned into weeks, the tension that simmered between them began to bubble over, spilling into moments that neither could ignore. It was a warm afternoon when Ethan appeared unannounced, his shirt damp with sweat from fixing the gutters. Diana busied herself in the kitchen, pretending not to notice the way his muscles shifted under his t-shirt as he leaned against the counter. When she offered him a glass of water, their fingers brushed, and the simple contact sent a jolt through her. She tried to pull her hand away, but Ethan's touch lingered a fraction too long, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Thank you," he said, his voice lower than usual. She nodded, her throat too tight to respond, and turned quickly back to the sink, hoping he didn't notice the way her hands trembled. Later that evening, Ethan showed up with dinner from her favorite Italian restaurant, a repeat of a gesture that had become all too familiar. "You're spoiling me," she said with a nervous laugh as he set the takeout on the counter. "Maybe you deserve to be spoiled," he replied, his tone playful but his gaze serious. They ate together at the dining table, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. The conversation veered into personal territory, with Ethan sharing stories about his father and the weight of living up to his expectations. Diana listened, her heart aching for him, and when he confessed his fears of failure, she reached out, her hand covering his. "You've done more than enough," she said softly. "Your father would be so proud of you." Ethan looked down at their joined hands, then back at her, his eyes searching. "And you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you proud of me?" Her breath caught in her throat at the vulnerability in his question. "Of course I am," she replied, her voice trembling. The words hung between them, laden with a meaning she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The turning point came a few days later. Ethan invited Diana on a hike, claiming she needed a break from the house. The trail was quiet, the sound of their footsteps blending with the rustling leaves. As they reached a clearing near the top, Ethan spread out a blanket and unpacked sandwiches and a thermos. "Always prepared," she teased, trying to mask her unease. "It's easier when you're with someone worth the effort," he replied, his voice soft but steady. They ate in silence, the tension between them almost unbearable. Diana's heart raced as she felt his gaze on her, and when their eyes finally met, the weight of everything unspoken settled between them like a storm about to break. On the hike back, the trail narrowed, and Ethan placed a hand on the small of her back to steady her. The touch was brief but electrifying, leaving her skin burning where his fingers had rested. When they reached the car, Ethan opened the door for her, his hand brushing hers as she climbed in. The drive home was quiet, but the air was thick with the tension they could no longer ignore. That evening, Ethan stayed longer than usual. They sat on the couch, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. At one point, their hands brushed as they both reached for a glass of water, and neither pulled away. Diana's breath hitched as Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low and steady. Her heart pounded, and she pulled her hand back, standing abruptly. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" he asked, rising to his feet. "It's the truth." The words hung in the air, and Diana felt her resolve crumbling. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "This isn't right," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "It feels right," he said softly. "And I think you know it." Before she could think, before she could stop herself, Diana closed the distance between them, her lips brushing against his. The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle exploration, but it quickly deepened, fueled by the emotions they had both been holding back. Ethan's hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer as the firelight danced around them. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "This changes everything," Diana whispered. It doesn't have to, Ethan replied, his voice steady. We'll figure it out together. The morning after their kiss, Diana awoke to a quiet house and a tumult of emotions. The memory of Ethan's lips on hers, the warmth of his touch, and the undeniable pull between them lingered like a dream she couldn't shake. She sat by the window with her coffee, the sunlight spilling across the floor, but her thoughts were stormy. She knew they had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of it sat heavy on her chest. Ethan arrived later that day, his familiar truck rumbling into the driveway. Diana felt her heart race as she watched him step out, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. He knocked lightly on the door before letting himself in, his presence filling the space like it always did. I figured these might brighten your day, he said with a soft smile, setting the flowers on the counter. Diana forced a smile, but her chest tightened as she looked at him. You didn't have to. I wanted to, he replied simply, his gaze lingering on her. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy and unspoken tension. Ethan worked on small repairs around the house while Diana busied herself in the kitchen, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach every time he walked by. But the quiet moments between them spoke louder than words. The brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a tool, the way his eyes lingered on her longer than they should. Each small interaction felt charged with something they both were afraid to name. By evening, the tension was unbearable. They sat on the porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of the wildflowers he had brought. The silence between them stretched until Ethan finally spoke. Diana, he began, his voice steady but quiet. We need to talk about this. She turned to him, her heart pounding. I know, she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. I can't pretend nothing's changed, he said, his gaze fixed on her. I care about you. More than I probably should. Diana looked away, her throat tightening. Ethan, this isn't normal, she said, her voice trembling. People wouldn't understand. Who cares what people think? He asked, his tone firm but not unkind. This is about us, not them. Before she could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Diana's chest tightened as she saw her sister, Megan, stepping out of her car. Panic surged through her. Megan had a knack for sensing when something was amiss, and Diana wasn't sure she could mask the storm of emotions roiling beneath the surface. Hey, Diana, Megan called cheerfully as she approached the porch. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, a curious smile playing on her lips. Ethan, nice to see you. You've been helping out around here a lot lately, haven't you? Ethan smiled politely, but Diana could feel the tension radiating from him. Just trying to make sure everything's in order, he said casually. Well, isn't that sweet? Megan said, her tone light but laced with something that made Diana's stomach churn. You've always been so thoughtful. Megan's visit felt endless, though in reality, she only stayed an hour. Every glance, every question, felt like an interrogation, and Diana was sure Megan could see right through her. When she finally left, Diana let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. Do you think she knows? She asked Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. You're overthinking it, he said gently. Even if she suspects something, she can't know for sure. But Diana wasn't so sure. The following days were a blur of anxiety and stolen moments with Ethan, each one a mix of passion and guilt. They couldn't seem to stay away from each other, despite the growing fear that their secret would come to light. The breaking point came one evening when Diana's neighbor, Mrs. Harper, stopped by unexpectedly. Diana and Ethan had been sitting in the living room, their closeness undeniable, when the knock at the door startled them both. Diana scrambled to her feet, smoothing her hair as she answered the door. Evening, Diana, Mrs. Harper said, her sharp eyes darting past her into the house. Just thought I'd drop off those recipes you asked for. Thank you, Diana said quickly, taking the papers from her. She could feel the weight of Mrs. Harper's gaze as the older woman glanced toward the living room, where Ethan stood, his hands shoved into his pockets. I see you've had some company, Mrs. Harper said, her tone dripping with curiosity. Ethan's been helping out around the house, Diana said, forcing a smile. He's always been so kind. Mrs. Harper said, her expression unreadable. Well, I won't keep you. Have a good night, dear. As soon as the door closed, Diana turned to Ethan, her chest heaving. People are starting to notice, she said, her voice shaking. We can't keep doing this. Ethan stepped closer, his hands resting gently on her arms. Diana, we can't let other people dictate how we feel, he said softly. What we have, it's real. Tears filled her eyes and she shook her head. But at what cost? What happens when everyone finds out? Then we face it together, he he said, his voice steady. No matter what. Diana's resolve crumbled at his words, and she leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his waist. For a moment, the world outside faded, leaving only the two of them. But the peace was short-lived. A few days later, Megan confronted Diana after hearing whispers in town. Is there something going on with you and Ethan? She demanded, her voice filled with disbelief and anger. Diana's heart sank as she realized there was no escaping the truth anymore. The walls she had built to protect herself, and Ethan, were crumbling, and the fallout was inevitable. The confrontation with Megan left Diana shaken to her core. Her sister's words echoed in her mind long after she left the house, leaving behind a tension so heavy it felt like a physical weight. You can't possibly think this is okay, Megan had said, her voice sharp with judgment. What would people say? What would Bill think if he were alive? That last question pierced Diana's heart, and for a moment, she could barely breathe. Bill! His name hung in the air, a reminder of everything she had lost, and everything she had now put at risk. Ethan arrived later that evening, finding Diana sitting on the porch with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. One look at her face told him everything. Megan knows, she said before he could speak, her voice flat and lifeless. Ethan's jaw tightened. What did she say? Diana shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. She's furious. She said I'm disrespecting Bill's memory. He crouched in front of her, his hands gently resting on her knees. Diana, what we feel, it doesn't erase what you had with Bill. It doesn't make it any less real. But it feels wrong, she whispered, her voice trembling. Every time I think about what people will say, I feel like I'm drowning. Ethan's gaze was steady, his voice firm. You can't live your life for other people. They don't understand what we've been through, what we've found in each other. If they want to judge us, let them. But we can't let that stop us from being happy. Diana wanted to believe him, but the fear of judgment was a shadow she couldn't seem to escape. Over the next few days, the whispers around town grew louder. Neighbors lingered too long at the edge of her driveway, their eyes narrowing when they saw Ethan's truck parked outside. Friends who once called regularly began to pull away, their silence more damning than words. Megan, unable to let the situation go, confronted Diana again. This time, her words were sharper, cutting through Diana's fragile composure. You're ruining everything, Megan said, her face flushed with anger. People are already talking. Do you really want to be the subject of every conversation in town? Diana fought back tears, her voice breaking. I didn't plan for this to happen, Megan. I didn't choose this. No, Megan snapped. But you're choosing to let it continue. When Ethan heard about the confrontation, his frustration boiled over. Why does it matter what they think, he demanded. They don't know us. They don't know what we've been through. It matters because I'm the one who has to live with the consequences, Diana shot back, her voice rising. I'm the one everyone will blame. Ethan stepped closer, his expression softening. We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a team. But Diana couldn't shake the guilt and fear that consumed her. She began to distance herself from Ethan, pulling away during conversations and finding excuses to avoid him. She thought that putting space between them might ease the tension, but it only made the ache in her chest worse. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the house felt emptier than ever. The silence was suffocating, and she realized with startling clarity that her fear of judgment was costing her the one thing that had brought her happiness in years. But even that clarity wasn't enough to dispel her doubt. The next day, Ethan confronted her. You're pulling away, he said, his voice calm but strained. And I need to know why. Diana hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. Because I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to face everyone's judgment and still hold on to you. You don't have to face it alone, he said, stepping closer. But you have to decide if this is what you want. Because I can't keep fighting for something you're too afraid to fight for, too. His words struck a nerve, and Diana felt the walls she'd built around herself begin to crumble. But before she could respond, Ethan turned and walked out, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in her ears. The days that followed were some of the loneliest Diana had ever experienced. She went through her routine mechanically, the weight of her choices bearing down on her. She missed Ethan more than she could put into words, but the fear of facing the world's judgment kept her rooted in place. It wasn't until Megan came over again, her tone softer this time, that Diana began to reconsider. I don't understand what you're doing, Megan said gently, but I do know that you've been happier lately. And maybe that's worth something. Those words stayed with Diana long after Megan left. She realized that, for all her fear, she couldn't deny the truth. Ethan made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. And if that meant facing the judgment of others, perhaps it was a price worth paying. That night, Diana called Ethan. Her voice shook as she said, "Can you come over? We need to talk." Ethan arrived within 20 minutes of Diana's call. She stood by the window, her heart pounding as she watched his truck pull into the driveway. The moment he stepped through the door, his eyes found hers, searching for answers. "What's going on, Diana?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. She hesitated, her thoughts swirling in a storm of fear and hope. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling. "I've been running away, Ethan. Not just from the world, but from myself. I've been so afraid of what people will think, of how they'll judge us. But the truth is, I don't want to lose you." Relief softened his expression, and he stepped closer, his hands finding hers. "You don't have to lose me," he said gently. "I've been here the whole time, waiting for you to see that what we have is worth fighting for." Tears welled in Diana's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of release. "I want this," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I want us. And I don't care what people think anymore. Let them judge me if they want." Ethan smiled, his hands tightening around hers. "We'll figure it out together," he promised. "No matter what happens." In the days that followed, Diana began to reclaim her life, starting with small, defiant acts of bravery. She stopped hiding her feelings for Ethan, no longer retreating to the safety of denial. When neighbors cast suspicious glances or whispered as she passed, she held her head high. Their judgment no longer carried the weight it once had. Megan, too, softened over time. Though she still didn't fully understand Diana's choices, she saw the light in her sister's eyes and couldn't deny the change in her. "You seem happier," Megan admitted one afternoon over coffee. "And maybe that's what matters most." Diana smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "It is," she said simply. As the weeks turned into months, Diana and Ethan built a life together, one rooted in honesty and resilience. There were challenges, of course, moments when doubt crept in or when whispers in town grew louder. But each time they faced it together, drawing strength from the bond they had forged. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Diana turned to Ethan. "Do you ever think about what people still say about us?" she asked softly. He shook his head, his gaze steady. "Not anymore," he replied. "They don't live our lives, we do. And as long as you're happy, that's all that matters to me." Diana smiled, leaning into him as the first stars appeared in the sky. For the first time in years, she felt at peace, not because the world had changed, but because she had. She had learned that happiness wasn't about living up to others' expectations. It was about being true to herself, even when it was difficult. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Diana realized something profound. Her life was no longer defined by the shadow of her past or the fear of judgment. It was defined by the choices she had made. The choice to let herself love again, to embrace the unexpected, and to fight for the happiness she deserved. And in that moment, she knew she had found something worth holding on to. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she and Ethan would face them together, stronger for everything they had endured. If you were in Diana's position, would you have the courage to fight for love against all odds? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories that push the boundaries of love, betrayal, and second chances. Stay tuned. Our next story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty and desire.